Hi, Jay. Hi, Luke McDaniel. Nice of you to show up. Oh, Xavier, you're president accounted for. Bram. Hey, Sean, man. Good to see you. Thanks for being here so early. That's awesome. Oh. I think we have like 15 seconds, so get yourself ready. 15 seconds? No, I was lying. You have like 10. In-Law Josie Wales, written originally by Trey Anastasio and the band Fish, but done in that case by Holly Bowling, like bowling ball. Hello, Caden. Nice of you to be here too. Good to see you. Good ups. Nice of you guys to show up. Good morning. Present and accounted for. I hope you are too. Thank you so much for being here. Let's talk really quickly about your reading space. I have gotten a few notes from a few of the people who I am closely connected with saying that their reading spot is set up and in full function. I have friends who are now reading their own books in their own reading sections and loving it. I'd love to see some pictures of people's reading nooks. I always love seeing where people are doing their reading. What else do I want to talk about today? While you have a minute, go make sure that you get your pieces of paper. Go make sure that you get your pens and colors. Sometimes I like to use multiple colors. Sometimes that always makes it even more impressive. Sometimes I might use one color for one chapter and another color for another chapter. And sometimes I say, okay, today I'm going to try using my illustrations more than I use my text. Sometimes I'm going to look for important quotes that I want to remember and think that are very important moments. There are always really cool moments within a story that are called turning points. And those are those moments where without that moment, the whole story would pretty much have taken a different turn or had gone a different direction. But because of that one moment, it changes everything. Do you remember that moment when we were reading and it talked a whole bunch about when old Dan was at the tree, at the sycamore, the giant sycamore. And during that giant sycamore moment, he had gone home because Grandpa had helped him with the scarecrow. And because of the scarecrow, he was able to take a good sleep. And he got up and he realized that old Dan wasn't anywhere to be found. And he gets out to the tree and he's looking at little Ann like, oh, she's a whole bunch of dead leaves that had been made into a nice little bedding. And it had shown that little Ann was there all night long and that she had come all the way back to the house in order to meet Billy, and that he felt bad. That was a turning point. That's a I will never doubt you again kind of moment. You know what I mean? And I bet that that turning point also happened when the dog saw that Billy meant business about chopping the big tree down as well. So yesterday, just real quickly, you got your paper out yet? Do you have your stuff? Are you ready to hear this next chapter? I'm ready to. Hold on. So one of the things that I want to share with you is what happened in chapter 10. What did we learn? Think about it. Did you draw any pictures to remind yourself? Did you write any words? Training was over. It was the hunt time. They had gotten Mr. Ringtail, and then they had met that other coon who tried to trick them by swimming across the river and doing some old tricks. And that was really what was happening in the last chapter, was that his dogs know how to hunt now. There was also the other thing, that he started spending some time with a group of men over at Grandpa's store. He used to stand on the outside and listen to all the coon hunters, but now he's right in the middle of it. And all the coon hunters are making fun of his dogs, but at the same point, who's got the most coon skins for sale in Grandpa's store? That's right, Billy. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 11, Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. I had often wondered what old Dan would do if little Ann ever got into some kind of a predicament. One night, I got my answer. So do you hear that part? Now we know what this chapter is going to be a lot of. A northern blizzard had been blowing. It was a bad one. The temperature dropped down to 10 below. The storm started with a slow, cold drizzle and then sleet. When the wind started blowing, everything froze, leaving the ground as slick as glass. Trapped indoors, I was as nervous as a fish out of water. I told Mama I guessed it was just going to storm all winter. She laughed and said, I don't think it will, but it does look like it will last for quite some time. She ruffled up my hair and kissed me between the eyes. This did rile me up. I didn't like to be kissed like that. It seemed that I could practically rub my skin off and still feel that kiss from my mama, all wet and sticky and kind of burning. Sometime on the 5th night, the storm blew itself out and it snowed about 3 inches. The next morning, I went out to my doghouse, scraping the snow away from the 2-way door. I stuck my head in. It was as warm as an oven. I got my face washed all over by little Ann. Old Dan's tail thumped out of tune on the wall. I told them to be ready because we were going hunting that night. I knew that the old ringtails would be hungry and stirring, for they had been denned up during that big old blizzard and storm. That evening, as I was leaving the house, Papa said, Billy, be careful tonight. It's slick down under that snow, and it'd be easy to twist an ankle or break a leg. I told him that I would, and that I wasn't going too far, just down the back of our fields in the bottoms. Well, anyway, he said, be careful. There'll be no moon tonight, and you're going to see some fog next to the river. Walking through our fields, I saw my father was right about it being slick and dark. Several times I slipped and sat down. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of my lantern, but I wasn't worried. My light was good, and Mama had insisted that I make 2 little leather pouches to cover the blades of my axe. Just before I reached the timber, old Dan shook the snow from the underbrush with his deep voice. Hoo! I stopped, tore their way out of the thick timber. Sorry about that. The deep bass tones rolled around under the tall sycamores, tore their way out of the thick timber, traveled out over the fields and slammed up against the foothills. There they seemed to break up and die away in the mountains. Old Dan was working the trail slowly, and I knew why. He would never line out until little Ann was running by his side. I thought she would never get there. When she did, her beautiful voice made the blood pound in my temples. I felt the excitement of the hunt as it ate its way into my body. Taking a deep breath, I reared back and whooped as loud as I could. Hoo-wee! The coon ran upriver for a way, and then cutting out of the bottoms, he headed for the mountains. I stood and listened until their voices went out of hearing sight. Slipping and sliding, I started in the direction I had last heard them. About halfway up the foothills, I heard them coming back our way. Somewhere in the rugged mountains, the coon had turned and headed toward the river. It was about time for him to play out a few more tricks, and I was wondering what he might do. I knew it would be hard for him to hide his trail with snow on the ground, and I realized later that the smart old coon knew this too. As the voices of my dogs grew louder as they moved toward me, I could tell that they were coming straight at me. Once I started to blow out my lantern, thinking that maybe I could see them when they crossed our field, but I realized I didn't stand a chance of seeing the race in the skunk black night. Ooh, I like that. Skunk black night. Why skunk black? Well, I guess skunks are black. Must be real dark. Down out of the mountains they brought him, singing a hound dog song on his heels. The coon must have scented me or seen my lantern. He cut to my right and ran between our house and me. I heard screaming and yelling from my sisters. My father started whooping. I knew my whole family was out on the porch listening to the beautiful voices of my little red hounds. I felt as tall as the tallest sycamore. The deep "oh, oh, oh" of old Dan and the sharp "oh, oh, oh" of little Ann bore a hole into the inky black night. The vibrations rolled and quivered in the icy silence. The coon was heading for the river again. I could tell my dogs were crowding him and wondered if he'd make it to the water. I was hoping he wouldn't, for I didn't want to wade the cold water unless I had to. I figured the smart old coon had a reason for turning and coming back to the river and wondered what trick he had in mind. I remembered something my grandfather might have told me. He said, "Never underestimate the cunning of an old river coon. When the nights are dark and the ground is frozen and slick, they can pull some mean tricks on a hound. Sometimes those tricks can be fatal." Did you have to stop and wonder what the word might be? Fatal? Well, you think about the fact around that word, it says that coons can play mean tricks on hounds, especially when the ground is frozen. Some of those tricks can be fatal. Let's see if we can find out. But it sounds a little bit like there might be a lot of danger in a situation like that. I was halfway through the fog-covered bottoms when the voice of my dog stopped. I stood still, waited, and listened. A cold silence settled over the bottoms. I could hear the snap and crack of sap-frozen limbs. From far back in the flinty hills, the long, lonesome howl of a timber wolf floated down the silent night. Across the river, I heard a cow moo. I knew the sound was coming from the Lowry place across the way. Not being able to hear the voices of my dogs gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I whooped and waited for one of them to bawl. As I stood waiting, I realized something was different in these bottoms. Something was missing. I wasn't worried about my dogs. I figured that the coon had pulled some trick, and sooner or later that they would unravel times, but still could get no answer. I whooped several times, but still could get no answer. Stumbling, slipping, and sliding, I started on. Reaching the river, I saw it was frozen over. I realized what my strange, uneasy feeling was. I had not been able to hear the sound of water. As I stood listening, I heard a gurgling out in the middle of the stream. The river wasn't frozen all the way across. The still eddy waters next to the banks had frozen, but out in the middle, where the current was swift, the water was running, leaving a trough in the ice pack. The gurgling sound I had heard was the swift current as it sucked its way through the channel. So it kind of sounds like that. But everything else is frozen, like the sides of the river are frozen. But there's little parts of it in the middle where the main current kind of flows through that never froze, because moving water, it's very hard for moving water to freeze. And so there's that place where the water's sucking, and sometimes it goes in and out, and so it goes kind of sucks in and out. Those of you who live up in the north where there are frozen rivers or frozen streams, you'll know it better than most of the people down here in the south. But for us in the south, we have to make sure that they know about it too, because they need to understand that not all water freezes. Moving water stays unfrozen until it's super cold. Anyway, go on back. So notice it's quiet. I had not gone far when I heard old Dan. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. He wasn't bawling on a trail or giving a tree bark. It was one long, continuous cry. In his deep voice, there seemed to be a pleading cry for help out in the air. Scared, worried, and with my heart beating like a churn, started toward the sound. Another cry, he let me know where he was. He was out in the middle of the ice pack. I couldn't see him for the fog. I called to him and he answered with a low whine. Again, I called old Dan's name. This time he ran to me. He wasn't the same dog. His tail was between his legs and his head was bowed down. He stopped about 7 feet from me. Sitting down on the ice, he raised his head and howled the most mournful cry I had ever heard. Turning around, he trotted back out onto the ice and disappeared into the fog. I knew something had happened to little Ann. I called her name. She answered with a pleading cry. Although I couldn't see her, I guessed what had happened. The coon had led them to the river. Running out onto the ice, he had leapt across the trough. My dogs, hot on the trail, had followed old Dan, a more powerful dog than little Ann, had made his leap. Little Ann had not made it. Her small feet had probably slipped on the slick ice, and she had fallen into the icy waters. Old Dan, seeing the fate of his little friend, had quit the chase, given up the coon, and had come back to try to help her. That smart old coon had pulled his trick, and a deadly one it was. Deadly one. I had to try to do something. She would never be able to get out by herself. It was only a matter of time until her body would be paralyzed by the freezing water. Laying my axe down, I held my lantern out in front of me, and I stepped out onto the ice. It started cracking and popping. I jumped back to the bank. Although it was thick enough to hold the light weight of my puppies, it would never hold a boy's weight like mine. Little Ann started whining and begging for help. I went all to pieces and started crying. Something had to be done, and done quickly, or my little dog was lost. I thought of running home for a rope or my father, but I knew she wouldn't last that long. I was desperate. It was impossible for me to swim the freezing water. I wouldn't last for a minute. She cried again, begging for the one thing I couldn't give her. Help. Help. I thought, if only I could see her, maybe I could figure out some way I could help. Looking at my lantern gave me an idea. I ran up the bank about 30 feet, turned and looked back. I could see the light. Not well, but enough for what I had in mind. I grabbed my lantern and axe and ran for the bottoms. I was looking for a stand of wild cane. After what seemed like ages, I found it. With the longest one I could find, I hurried back. After it was trimmed and the limber end cut off, I hung the lantern by the handle on the end of it and started easing it out onto the ice. I saw old Dan first. He was sitting close to the edge of the trough, looking down. Then I saw her. I groaned at her plight. All I could see was her head and her small little front paws. Her claws were spread out and digging into the ice. She knew if she ever lost that hold, she was gone under the ice and down the river. I wanted to get my light as close to little Ann as I could. Old Dan raised his head and howled. Hound though he was, he knew it was the end of the trail for his little pal. I wanted to get my light as close to little Ann as I could, but my pole was as good 8 feet short. Setting the lantern down, I eased the pole from under the handle. I thought, I'm no better off than I was before. In fact, I'm worse off now. Now I can see when the end is coming. Little Ann cried again. I saw her claws slip on the ice. Her body settled lower on the water. Old Dan howled and started fidgeting. He knew the end was close too. Little Ann cried again. I saw her claws slip. Her body settled lower. Old Dan howled again. I didn't exactly know when I started out toward my dog, but I had taken only 2 steps when the ice began to break. I twisted my body and fell toward the bank. Just as my hand closed on a root, I thought my feet touched the bottom. I wasn't sure. As I pulled myself out, I felt the numbing cold creep over my legs. It looked so hopeless. There didn't seem to be any way I could save little Ann. At the edge of the water stood a large sycamore tree. I got behind it, anything to blot out that heartbreaking scene. Little Ann, thinking I had deserted her, started crying. I couldn't stand it. I opened my mouth to call old Dan. I wanted to tell him to come on and that we would go home, and there was nothing that we could do to help little Ann. The words just wouldn't come out. I couldn't utter a sound. I lay my face against the icy cold bark of the sycamore. I thought of the prayer I had said when I had asked God to help me to get those 2 hound pups. I knelt down and I sobbed out a prayer. I asked for a miracle which would save the life of my little dog. I promised all the things that a young boy might, if only he would help me. Still saying my prayer and making my promises, I heard a sharp, metallic sound. I jumped up and stepped away from the tree. I was sure the noise I heard was made by the rattling chain on the front end of a boat. I shouted as loud as I could, "Over here! I need help! My dog is drowning!" I waited for an answer. All I could hear were the cries of little Ann. Again I hollered, "Over here! Over on the bank! Can you see my light? I need help! Please hurry!" I held my breath, waiting for an answering shout. I shivered from the freezing cold of my wet shoes and overalls. A straining silence settled over the river. A feathery rustle swished by in the blackness. A flock of low-flying ducks had been disturbed by my loud shouts. I strained my ears for some sound. Now and then I could hear the lapping slap of the ice-cold water as it swirled its way through the trough. I glanced to little Ann. She was still holding on, but I saw her paws were almost at the very edge. I knew her time was short. I couldn't figure out what I had heard. The sound was made by metal striking metal, but what was it? What could it have caused it? I looked at my axe. It couldn't have made the sound as it was too close to me. The noise had come from out in the river. When I looked at my lantern, I knew that it had made the strange sound. I had left the handle standing straight up when I had taken the pole away. Now it was down. For some unknown reason, the stiff wire handle had twisted on the sockets and dropped. As it had fallen, it had struck the metal frame, making the sharp, metallic sound I had heard. As I stared at the yellow glow of my lantern, the last bit of hope faded away. I closed my eyes, intending to pray again for the help I so desperately needed. Then, like a blinding red flash, the message of the lantern bore its way into my brain. There was my miracle. What is it? What's his miracle? The chapter just ends. Oh, it's over. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I just wanted to see how close you were getting to the screen when you were hearing this part. The lantern bore its way into my brain. There was my miracle. There was the way to save my dog. In the metallic sound I had heard were my instructions. They were so plain, I couldn't help but understand them. The bright yellow flame started flickering and dancing. It seemed to be saying, "Hurry, you know what to do." Faster than I had ever moved in my life, I went to work. With a stick, I measured the water in the hole where my feet had broken through the ice. I was right. My foot had touched bottom. 18 inches down, I felt soft mud. With my pole, I fished the lantern back to the bank. I took the handle off, straightened it out, and I bent a hook on one end with one of my shoelaces. I tied the wire to the end of the cane pole. I left the hook sticking about 6 inches beyond the end of it. I started shouting encouragement to little Ann. I told her to hang on and not to give up, for I was going to save her. She answered with a low cry, as if she might not believe me. With the hook stuck in one of the ventilating holes in the top of my light, I lifted it back out onto the ice and set it down. After a little wiggling and pushing, I worked the hook loose and laid the pole down. I took off my clothes, picked up my axe, stepped down into the hole of the icy water, and took a giant deep breath. It came to my knees. Step by step, breaking the ice with my axe, I waded out. The water came up to my hips and then to my waist. The cold bite of that water took my breath away. I felt my body grow numb. I couldn't feel my feet at all, but I knew they were moving. When the water reached my armpits, I stopped and I worked my pole toward Little Ann, stretching my arms as far out as I could. I saw I was still a foot short. Closing my eyes and gritting my teeth, I moved deeper into the river. The water reached my chin. I was close enough. I started hooking at the collar of Little Ann. Time after time after time, I felt the hook almost catch. I saw I was fishing on a wrong angle. She had settled so low in the water, I couldn't get to her collar. Raising my arms above my head so the pole would be on a slant, I kept trying to hook and pray. I tried to reach it. I kept hooking and praying. The seconds ticked by. I strained for one more inch. The muscles in my arms grew numb from the weight of the pole. Little Ann's claws slipped again. I thought she was gone. At the very edge of the ice, she caught herself again. All I could see now were her small little red paws and her little nose and her eyes sticking up. By old Dan's actions, I could tell he understood and wanted to help. He ran over close to my pole and started digging at the ice. I whooped him with the cane. That was the only time in my life I ever hit any of my dogs. I had to get him out of the way so that I could see what I was doing. Just when I thought my task was impossible, I felt the hook slide under the leather of her collar. It was none too soon. As gently as I could, I dragged her over the rim of the ice. At first, I thought she was dead. She wasn't moving. Old Dan started whining and licking her face and ears. She moved her head. I started talking to her. She made an effort to stand, but she couldn't. Her muscles were paralyzed and the blood had long since ceased to flow. At the movement of Little Ann, old Dan threw a fit. He started barking and jumping. His long red tail fanned the air. Still holding onto my pole, I tried to take a step backward. My feet wouldn't move. A cold, gripping fear came over me. I thought my legs were frozen. I made another effort to lift my leg, and it moved. I realized that my feet were stuck in the soft, muddy bottom. I started backing out, dragging the body of my little dog. I couldn't feel the pole in my hands anymore. When my feet touched the icy bank, I couldn't feel that either. All the feeling in my body was gone. I wrapped Little Ann in my coat, and I hurried into my clothes. With the pole, I fished my light back. Close by was a large drift. I climbed up on the top of it and dug a hole down through the ice and snow until I reached the dry limbs. I poured half of the oil in my lantern down into that hole and dropped in a match. In no time, I had a roaring fire. I laid Little Ann so close to that warm heat and went to work on old Dan, washing her head with his warm red tongue while I massaged and rubbed her body back to life. I could tell by her cries when the blood started circulating. Little by little, her strength began to come back. I stood her on her little feet and started walking her. She was weak and wobbly, but she knew she was going to live. I felt much better and breathed a sigh of relief. After drying myself out the very best I could, I took the lantern handle from the pole, bent it back to its original position, put it back on the lantern. Holding the light out in front of me, I looked at it. The bright metal gleamed in the firelight glow. I started talking to the lantern. I said, "Thanks, old lantern, more than you'll ever know. I'll always take care of you. Your globe will always be clean, and there'll never be any rust or dirt on your frame." I knew if it had not been for the miracle of that lantern, my little dog would have met her death that night. Her grave would have been in the cold, icy waters of the Illinois River. Out in that river, I could hear the cold water gurgling in the icy trough. It seemed to be angry. It hissed and growled as it tore its way through the channel. I shuddered to think of what might have happened. Before I left for home, I walked back to that sycamore tree. Once again, I said a prayer, but this time the words were different. I wasn't asking for a miracle this time. In every way a young boy could, I said thanks. My second prayer wasn't said with just words. All of my heart and soul were said in it. On my way home, I decided not to say anything to my mother and father about Little Ann's accident. I knew that it would scare Mama, and she might stop my hunting. Reaching our house, I didn't hang the lantern in its usual place. I took it to my room and set it in a corner with the handle standing up. The next morning, I started sneezing and came down with a terrible cold. I told Mama that I had gotten my feet wet. Gotten his feet wet. Really? Is that all that got wet, Billy? The next morning, I started sneezing and coming down with a terrible cold. I told Mama I had gotten my feet wet. She scolded me a little and started doctoring me. For 3 long days and 3 long nights, I stayed home. All this time, I kept checking the handle of the lantern. My sisters shook the house from roof to floor with their playing and their romping, but that handle never fell. I went to my mother and asked her if God answered prayers every time one was said. She smiled and said, "No, Billy, not every time. He only answers the ones that are said from the heart. You have to be sincere and believe." She wanted to know why I had asked. I said, "Oh, I just was wondering. I just wanted to know." She came over and straightened my suspenders, saying, "That was a very nice question for my little Daniel Boone to ask." Bending over, she started kissing me. I finally squirmed away from her, feeling as wet as a dirt dauber's nest. My mother never could kiss me like a fellow should be kissed. Before she was done, I was kissed all over. It always made me feel silly and baby-like. I tried to tell her that a coon hunter wasn't supposed to be kissed that way, but Mama never could understand things like that. I stomped out of the house to see how my dogs were once I got better. Whew. Holy moly. Ladies and gentlemen, the most exciting story yet. We almost lost little Ann. Did you feel your heart beating? I felt my heart beating. My goodness. What I want to ask you is this is my following question as we close today. I'm sorry if there was any cuts. I know that my kids are saying that sometimes it cuts in and cuts out. I sure would like to read out loud, and so would he. But if we can't do that, I'll do on the inside. I hope that you got most of the story, the gist. I'll tell you one way that you can save yourself is if you get your library book, Where the Red Fern Grows, and have that in front of you when we're reading, you could definitely make sure that you didn't miss anything. But I'm betting that in this 34 minutes that we've been together, you probably got the gist of what we were talking about. If you need me to, please write me a note and tell me what else I need to do. The last thing that I want to say to you before we go is my last kind of comprehension discussion question. Do you think it was right that Billy didn't tell his parents? Why didn't he tell his parents? And was it okay that he didn't tell his parents? I'm seeing some people. Jay, I'm seeing you make some statements, but I don't want to know why. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it is Wednesday. Tomorrow we will be together again at 3:30 live. I want to see some pictures of people's reading nooks. I want to see what kind of books you're reading on the side. And more importantly, I want you to go outside and play. I want you to go get barefoot. Now that we know that Billy's been playing around in freezing water and wintry weather, I'm wondering, is he wearing shoes? Because I've never heard him wearing shoes yet. I think maybe the author might have forgotten that. Anyway, without further ado, thank you for being here. Thank you for being wonderful. Thanks for coming back. And until we see each other again, be safe, be merry, go love somebody, kiss them all over like Mama kisses Billy. And we'll talk to you soon. Love you lots. Now get out of here. Thank you again.